All right, welcome back to Fundamentals of Philosophy. This is Module 5, in which we talk about free will and determinism. All right, so Modules 4 and 5 of this course have both been concerned with topics within the area of philosophy known as metaphysics. The term metaphysics originates from the Greek philosopher Aristotle and translates roughly to after physics. The origin of this term is a bit of a historical accident, actually. It was the name applied by a subsequent editor to the book that Aristotle wrote chronologically after his book Physics. So literally, the book that comes after the physics is metaphysics. But the content of Aristotle's metaphysics has come to characterize the field of philosophical study that is concerned with the most general, fundamental, and wide-ranging questions of existence. Aristotle referred to this as the study of being qua being, or the study of existence in itself. The topics studied by metaphysicians include possibility and necessity, universals and particulars, substance and change, time and space, ontology, causality, and the nature of consciousness, which we did last module. And also this week's topic, the problem of free will. So what is free will? Do we freely choose our own actions, or is everything that we think and do simply the playing out of a predetermined chain of causal events stretching back to the Big Bang? Are our intuitions regarding our individual freedom actually compatible with a deterministic understanding of the universe? If determinism is false, does that leave us with genuine free choice or simply random chance? And how are we to understand the question of moral responsibility in the absence of free choice? In this module, we'll be looking at various responses to these questions. The essential conflicts... Well, that's too big. Let's bring that down. The essential conflicts are between the following positions. Libertarian free will, which is the position that we are autonomous agents who freely choose our own actions. Hard determinism, which is the position that free will is an illusion. Our actions and the psychological intentions behind them are all causally determined by external forces, such as the law of physics, biology, genetics, the environment, culture, etc. We'll mainly be talking about physical or causal determinism in this module, and won't be getting into genetics, environment, and culture so much. Compatibilism, sometimes known as soft determinism, there's a little bit of a distinction, but it's not important for the purposes of this course, which is the position that nature is causally deterministic, but this is compatible with freedom. So determinism and freedom are compatible because what we mean by freedom is not indeterminism, but freedom from coercion, and we'll get into that more in a bit. And indeterminism, which is the position that nature is not deterministic, or is not completely deterministic at least. There are elements of randomness and chance that open the possibility of true autonomous action. Now, some of the concepts and issues that arise from these positions are going to include the principle of alternative possibilities, or the PAP, which states that an action is freely chosen if and only if it was possible for the agent to perform a different action under the same circumstances. Moral responsibility, the position that if every action is predetermined by nature or cultural factors, then in what sense can we say that someone should be held morally responsible for their actions if everything was already predetermined and they didn't choose it freely? Crime and punishment. If every action is predetermined, what justification do we have for exacting punishment upon individuals who could not have chosen to act otherwise? In our first reading, Thomas Nagel, taking a break from thinking about what it's like to be a bat in the last module, provides us with a nice overview and summary of the basic issues at play in the free will debate. We seem to have something like an innate intuition that we possess the ability to choose our actions freely. When we make a choice, for example, to eat a piece of cake instead of a peach, that's Nagel's example, We feel as though we could have possibly chosen otherwise and eaten the peach instead. We didn't have to choose the cake. But this conflicts with our understanding of the universe, right? Which assumes the existence of exceptionalist laws of nature. Our decision to eat the cake is not an exception to those laws of nature. It's still an event happening in the universe, a natural event. Every event is causally determined by the circumstances that precede it. There was never a true possibility that we would not eat the cake. We were always going to eat the cake. It was decided long before we were ever born that we were going to eat that cake. This deterministic viewpoint appears to conflict with our intuitions regarding moral responsibility. What sense is there in ascribing praise or blame to an individual for an act that was inevitable given the laws of nature? Or are we still justified in punishing bad behaviors that aren't freely chosen because we believe that doing so will make it less likely that those behaviors will occur again? Maybe determinism isn't actually true. And events in the universe are instead shot through with randomness and pure chance. But if our decision to eat the cake was purely random, that still doesn't appear to make an instance of free choice, right? To be responsible for an action, it seems that it must be determined by some type of internal psychological cause, like a desire. You had to have internally been in a state where you desired to eat the cake, and that's what caused you to eat the cake. If it's just random, there was no agency on your part, just suddenly you find yourself eating cake, that does not seem to be an act of free will. So an appeal to randomness does not appear to actually resolve the problem. Nagel sets out these problems kind of as an overview. He's sort of setting the stage. He doesn't come to a final conclusion about this. He doesn't really stake out a position, and it's from a book he wrote that's sort of an intro and overview of philosophy. So he's not trying to solve the problem here, but he is trying to lay out the stakes and show you what's at risk here in the question of free will versus determinism. So, determinism. More demons. Philosophers spend a lot of time worrying about demons. So do mathematicians, apparently. So in addition to Descartes' demon deceiver, who we looked at in the last two modules, really, the French mathematician Pierre-Simon Laplace introduces a different malevolent entity known as Laplace's demon. And the power of Laplace's demon is this. It knows the position and momentum of every atom in the universe. So every particle out there, it knows where it's at, where it's going, how fast it's going, all of that stuff. According to classical physics, Newtonian physics, given this knowledge, the demon is able to predict exactly where every atom will be at any point in the future, and from that knowledge deduce the exact location of every atom at any point in the past. So Laplace's demon is omniscient, all-knowing, because it knows the physical state of the universe at any given moment in time. It knows everything that has ever happened and everything that will ever happen. It can deduce that or predict that if it knows the position and momentum of every particle. So Laplace's demon is able to predict the future and the past because it occupies a universe in which every event is the direct result of the events which precede it, extending forward into the future and backwards into the past in a causal chain leading to the very beginning of time. There was never a possibility that any event could have occurred otherwise than it did. This is the deterministic picture of the universe. A deterministic universe is utterly devoid of chance. It is a clockwork machine where every event necessarily follows from one another with no possibility of alternative. Assuming that humans and human minds are themselves natural events occurring within the universe, then it would seem that human actions are similarly determined in advance by the prior state of the universe. We're not outside of nature, we're in nature, so we're a part of that causal physical chain. If the demon of Laplace's demon is able to predict any future state or past state of the universe, that includes us, that includes our thoughts, that includes our actions. All of that is predetermined. And our intuitions on this view regarding free will, therefore, must be false. Contrary to this is a position known as libertarian free will. So the deterministic picture violates our sense of our own power to make free choices in our own lives. And as Nagel was saying, it feels like we have an intuition in that regard, like we have this innate sense that our actions are freely chosen. So the position that all of our actions are freely chosen is known as metaphysical libertarianism. This is not to be confused with political libertarianism, which is a completely different thing that we're actually going to be looking at in Module 7 when we read Robert Nozick. So, to the metaphysical libertarian, to the free will libertarian, a world without agency is a bleak prospect, rendering us all mere puppets spinning on fate's strings. We have no agency, we are making no choices, we are just being strung along by this causal chain of necessity. Such a world violates our sense of social and moral responsibility. Prisons overflow with convicts who never had a legitimate choice in their crimes. And our imprisonment of them was similarly fated. We never had a choice. They never had a choice but to do the crime, and we never had a choice but to imprison them. We are all locked in this grim cycle, endlessly enacting these empty, scripted rituals of crime and punishment over which we have no actual control. Kind of grim. So there have been a lot of attempts to resolve this apparent contradiction between our intuitions regarding libertarian free will and our deterministic understanding of the universe. One popular approach is known as compatibilism. The core thesis of compatibilism is that the apparent contradiction between free will and determinism is false, that they are compatible, hence the name. The core move of compatibilism originates with David Hume, who you will recall from previous modules. For Hume, the problem arises from an ambiguity in our use of terms like freedom. When we look at the world, we assume that there exists some special causal connection, some necessary connection between objects and their effects. And we talked about this before. This is Hume's critique of causation. But we don't feel a similar special necessary connection when we look inward, when we introspect and examine our motives and our actions, our intent and our will to do something, and then the act of doing something, eating the cake or the peach. So we assume that the connection between our motives and actions must be a different kind of thing than the connection between objects and events, that they must be two different categories of things. The necessity and freedom have to be different in some metaphysical sense. But as we saw in Module 3, Hume is a skeptic about the existence of any special necessary connection between objects and events. He doesn't believe that we actually experience that it's a habit that arrives from us constantly seeing events occur one after the other. When we examine our sense impressions, all we find is constant conjunction. Just one type of event consistently followed by another type of event. And when we examine our motives and actions, according to Hume, through introspection, we find the same sort of connection. When we will something, like the eating of a piece of cake, I'm going to keep using that example. It's a simple, straightforward one, so I'm going to use Nagel's example throughout this lecture. When we will something like eating the piece of cake, we find that this event is reliably followed by the action of eating the cake. Unless some external force prevents us from performing the action, unless someone steps in and stops us from eating the cake. Now, you have to save some for the bride and groom. You've had enough cake. You are cut off. You set the cake down. Unless something prevents us from doing it, then we find that our actions reliably follow our intentions, our motives, our will. And according to Hume, when we talk about freedom, this is what we really mean. Freedom from coercion. Freedom from coercion. We mean that our will to perform some action is reliably performed by the performance, our will to perform some action is reliably followed by the performance of that action. So when we will something to happen, it reliably happens unless someone is there preventing us, unless there's some external force or agency. The police break in and prevent us from eating cake. But this doesn't in any way conflict with the sort of necessity that we witness in nature, according to Hume, because it's the same type of thing. Just one type of event reliably following another. Just one thing after another. Remember, Hume is a skeptic of that secret underlying mysterious necessity that's supposed to tie a cause to an effect. So according to him, and he applies the same logic here, he's being consistent. We lack freedom only when some external force severs our will from our action. When there's something that prevents us from doing something that we are willing ourselves to do, that we want to do. Or forces us to do something that we don't want to do. We are free insofar as we are not being coerced by another. So that's the foundational move of compatibilism, of the original sort of classic compatibilism that started with Hume. Contemporary compatibilists, and it is probably the dominant position among people who look into the free will determinism debate. Compatibilism tends to be where most people fall on this. And you can decide for yourself if this is adequate, because there are a lot of people who criticize this position and say it doesn't really address the problem, it just sort of skirts the question. But we'll come to that. So contemporary compatibilists tend to discard Hume's whole skepticism about causation as necessary connection, although there are certainly philosophers who still believe that. Contemporary compatibilists do retain his point, though, about the conflict between freedom and determinism being merely verbal. And that's what that comes down to, that this is a verbal dispute. This is a dispute about terminology, that we are defining freedom in an inappropriate way that makes it seem like it's incompatible with causation, necessity, determinism. Whereas if we look at freedom and define it in the proper way, then we'll find that there was never a conflict in the first place. So a very kind of Wittgensteinian move. So this type of compatibilism typically accepts the causal determinism of the universe, but argues that freedom, properly understood as freedom from coercion, is fully compatible with that type of determinism. So they're not arguing against determinism. They're not quite as skeptical as Hume. Few people are quite as skeptical as Hume. He was fairly thoroughgoing. But so they accept that there is determinism out in nature, but they believe that this is compatible with freedom as long as you are free from coercion. So this position is sometimes, and not always in a complimentary way, referred to as soft determinism, because they're still accepting some form of determinism. And that's to distinguish it from what's sometimes called hard determinism, which states that free will is an illusion, that it's all just the causal chain, and that people who accept hard determinism usually aren't satisfied with the compatibilist position, and obviously not with libertarian free will. It's all just determined all back from the Big Bang. Everything, eating the cake or the peach, was determined from the beginning of time. W.T. Stace, in our readings, provides a contemporary example of compatibilism. Freedom in Stace's view does not refer to whether an object was determined, but instead refers to how an object was determined. So he's still accepting determinism, but he distinguishes between an internal and an external cause. So, and he's following Hume in this, to an extent, not going as far with it as Hume did. But he believes that if an action is caused by the internal psychological state of the agent, so if you desire or will, or you have an impulse, you have an emotion, something that is driving you to do something, an internal psychological state, subjective, then it is a free action. If, however, an action is caused or prevented through coercion by some force external to the agent, something outside, then we are justified in referring to this as an unfree action. So this is how he's distinguishing a free action from an unfree action. Stephen M. Kahn, who's our illustrious editor as well as the author of several essays in the book he edited, formalizes this distinction syllogistically. I should have put this P1, P2, and then C for conclusion, but I'll fix that before I send it out. So he does this in syllogistic format. Premise 1, no action is free if it must occur. So no action is free if it must occur. If it had to be, it was necessitated. There was no alternative possibility. Premise 2, for every event that occurs, antecedent conditions, known or unknown, ensure the event's occurrence. So for everything that occurs, there was this causal chain of necessity that made it so that that event would occur. Conclusion, therefore, no action is free. If you accept P1 and P2, that no action is free if it must occur, and that for every event that occurs, antecedent conditions, known or unknown, ensure the event's occurrence, then the conclusion that no action is free has led you to the conclusion, essentially, of hard determinism. Those are the steps, according to Kant. That's how he sets this up. So the difference between that and soft determinism is soft determinists accept premise 2. They accept that for every event that occurs, antecedent conditions, known or unknown, ensure the event's occurrence. So the event is guaranteed by what happened prior to it. But they reject P1, premise 1, which is no action is free if it must occur. They do not believe that this disproves freedom. That the fact that something had to occur doesn't mean that you can't have freedom or free will, because they mean something different when they talk about freedom or free will. They are talking about how something was determined, whether it was determined by an internal state versus external coercion. On the other hand, if you accept premise 1, that no action is free if it must occur, and you reject P2, that for every event, premise 2, for every event, antecedent conditions caused it. If you accept the idea that there was a causal chain that determined every single event, including everything you see, say, do, if you reject that and accept that no action is free if it must occur, if premise 2 is true, then that leads you to libertarianism about free will. So that's the way, and this is all written up in the text version of this I'm going to send out. So, and it's in the PowerPoint too. So that is how Stephen M. Kahn sort of formalizes the compatibilist position. So as Nagel points out, a lot turns on the question of whether or not we could have possibly chosen not to eat that piece of cake. That's an important piece of cake that Nagel's talking about there. So William James, who we'll talk more about in a bit, very famous guy, honestly one of my favorite philosophers. William James is one of the handful of philosophers who is actually enjoyable to read as a prose stylist, in addition to the quality of his ideas and thoughts. Nietzsche is another guy like this, who were just really good writers. He was the brother of the writer Henry James, who wrote Turn of the Screw, and is generally, I think, considered the better writer of the two, William James. He's also, for those of you in psych who are pursuing a psychology degree, William James is one of the primary people responsible for the foundation of psychology as its own independent discipline. He was a scientist, psychologist, philosopher, writer, just public speaker, statesman, philosopher of religion, and various other things. Kind of did a little bit of everything, and a fascinating individual and a great writer, and I recommend his stuff highly. So James has another famous illustration of the, he wouldn't have called it the principle of alternative possibilities. So terminology wasn't around yet, but he captures the same idea. So he considers two paths that he might take walking home after he gives a lecture, right? He's giving a lecture, he's done with the lecture, he's going home. There are two paths he could take. In one possible universe, James chooses to walk home by taking the path along Divinity Avenue. And this is when he was at Oxford. In another possible universe, James instead chooses the path that goes along Oxford Street. So he's got two paths he could take, Divinity Avenue and Oxford Street. Now, from James's perspective, everything up to that point, up to that moment in time, has indicated to him that it's equally possible that he could take either Divinity Avenue or Oxford Street. There's nothing about the state of the universe that makes it impossible for him to choose Oxford Street over Divinity Avenue or the other way around. But once that decision has been made, if you're a determinist, you're going to look back on that moment, and from either universe, and this is kind of the key move here, a determinist observer in either universe would look back upon the choice between Divinity Avenue and Oxford Street and claim that whichever path was in fact taken in that universe was the only path that was ever actually possible. So Universe A, he takes Divinity Avenue, and Universe B, he takes Oxford Street. And after he makes this choice, in both universes, there's some determinist who looks back, and it doesn't matter which path James takes. They're going to say that's the only one he could have taken from the perspective of within that universe. And he doesn't quite formulate this in terms of possible universes, because that sort of talk hadn't become prominent in philosophy yet. But he's sort of talks about it as if I take Divinity Avenue, and then, God erases the last 10 minutes and sends me back, like rewinds the tape and sends me back to take Oxford Street. But it's still the same basic idea that you've got these two possible worlds in which these two alternatives happen, and from retrospectively, each one looks deterministic when the decision has already been made and you're looking back at it. Whereas before the decision has been made, James thinks it's an open question. So this is, to me, a wonderfully clear example of the principle of alternative possibilities, the PAP. If it was in principle possible that one action could have been chosen instead of another, then we are justified in saying that the action that did occur was freely chosen, and therefore that the agent is morally responsible for the outcomes of that action. So again, if you could have chosen otherwise, if the decision that you made to eat the cake, if you could have chosen to eat the peach, then you're responsible for eating the cake. If you couldn't have chosen, if there was no possibility, if there was something preventing you, if the cake didn't exist, if there was the chain of causal necessity ensured that there was no possible universe in which you ever had the peach, you were always going to eat the cake. Any of those things, if there's not a possibility that you could have chosen otherwise, then it wasn't a free action. And that's the principle of alternative possibilities. That's a key principle in the debate on free will. But not everybody buys it. And we're going to talk about Harry Frankfurt and Frankfurt-style cases, which is one of the examples, counterexamples to the PAP. So it's been generally taken for granted that the existence of alternate possibilities is a necessary condition, and they're your necessary and sufficient conditions. Once again, told you they were going to come up a lot. The PAP is a necessary condition for attributing moral responsibility to an agent for the outcome of an action. How can you be responsible for something if you couldn't have chosen otherwise? If there was no possibility that we could have chosen to act differently, then in what sense can we be held responsible or face consequences for our actions? What will be the justification of, praising or condemning someone for something that they didn't choose to do? And recall that if a condition is necessary, then it has to be the case in order for the conclusion to follow. So there has to be alternate possibilities in order for moral responsibility to be justified. You can't, this is the necessity condition. You can't have moral responsibility for an action without that action having been freely chosen amongst possible alternatives. So, and this bit's, the Frankfurt stuff gets a little technical, so we're not gonna have any I'm gonna go through it. It's not gonna be in the test though, so don't feel like you have to master Frankfurt style cases or Neil Levy's responses. Although they are, I think, very interesting, and I think they're definitely worth reading. So Frankfurt imagines a series of cases that are intended to demonstrate that the PAP does not meet the criteria for a necessary condition for moral responsibility. That's what he's trying to do, is show that you can still ascribe moral responsibility in a situation in which there are not actually alternate possibilities. And if he can do that, if he can establish just one, no matter how out there it is, one scenario in which you have an agent who is morally responsible for their actions, even though there was no alternative, then then it's not necessary. That's the strength of the necessity condition, and he's trying to undermine that. So in a typical example, and I'm kind of like combining some different stuff here to make it simple, in the longer version of Frankfurt's article, not the version that's in your book, he gives like several different examples to illustrate this, and the Kahn textbook kind of just as a very condensed version of it. But I'm going to try. I'm going to use Nagel's cake and peach again. I'm going to stick with that for now. So in a typical example, Jones, and usually it's Jones and Black are the two people, and it's kind of like Smith and Jones, or yeah. So in a typical example, Jones believes that she has two choices: to either eat cake or eat a peach. For example, to use again Nagel's example, Jones believes that both of these options are available to her, and she makes a choice to eat the cake. Based on this belief, she can have either the cake or the peach, and she chooses to eat the cake. That's what she believes is happening. But she's wrong. Her belief is false. There is a mad scientist named Black, and a lot of these thought experiments have, like mad scientists and things like that in them, because you have to sort of create these really sort of elaborately worked out counterexamples in order to undercut the necessity or sufficiency conditions. So that's why a lot of these get into sci-fi territory. Or, I mean, before science fiction was a thing, you have Descartes' evil demon and that sort of thing. And it's a way to sort of demonstrate that there are ways that you can sort of undermine things that seem otherwise certain. So, in a sense, Descartes may be the guy who really stands at the forefront of this. I mean, he's considered the father of modern philosophy for a reason. So Jones believes that she has two choices. She can eat the cake or eat the peach, and she eats the cake, and she believes that she has made that choice of her own free will, and that she had the choice to do so out of two alternative possibilities. But she's wrong, because a mad scientist named Black has secretly implanted a chip in her brain that would immediately be triggered if she tried to eat the peach, and it would stop her from eating the peach. So if she's got the peach and the cake in front of her and believes that she has a free choice between the two of them. But if she had actually tried to eat the peach, the chip would have been triggered and it would have prevented her from doing so. So she did not have a real possibility. It didn't occur. The chip didn't trigger. It didn't go off because she never tried to eat the peach. She ate the cake. She, of her own free will, she thinks, and I think Frankfurt agrees here, she ate the cake, never realizing that had she attempted to eat the peach, then the chip in her brain would have triggered and prevented her from doing so. So, even though eating the peach was never an actual possibility, she could have never possibly eaten the peach, the brain chip would have stopped her. But she chooses to eat the cake based upon her belief that she could have chosen to eat the peach. You get the distinction that Frankfurt's drawing here. So, according to Frankfurt, Jones is still morally responsible for her action, even though she never really had an alternative possibility. She didn't know that. She didn't know that the chip would go off if she reached for the peach instead of the cake. She believes that she is making a fair choice between two equally possible alternatives when she chooses the cake. So the moral responsibility falls on her. It was her internal motivations that drove her to reach for the cake rather than any sort of external coercion or something like that. And according to Frankfurt, this is enough to undermine the principle of alternative possibilities as a necessary condition for moral responsibility. Because he's just demonstrated that you can be morally responsible for an action even if you didn't really have legitimate choice, even if you didn't realize that you didn't have a choice. So the responsibility in this case is instead grounded in Jones's internal motivation for performing the action. From her perspective, she wanted to eat the cake. That's why she ate the cake. The result seems to demonstrate that moral responsibility can, in fact, be compatible with causal determinism. Now, Neil Levy believes that Frankfurt-style cases, or FSCs, as they're sometimes called, there's a lot of them out there, overlook the fact that the capacities of agents may change depending on the context. So what does that mean? So what is a capacity? A capacity in this regard is simply the ability that someone has to perform an action. The ability that an agent has to do something. That's capacity. So if Black, in Frankfurt's example, can block some capacity that Jones believes she has, like she thinks she has the ability to eat the peach, but it's being blocked by something external, which is the mad scientist, something in the external context. But according to Levy, if we can imagine that, we can imagine the alternative scenario in which Black similarly believes she doesn't have a capacity to do something, but the scientist gives her that capacity rather than taking it away. So we can still attribute her action to an external agency, is the move that Levy's making here. So Levy's point is there seems to be no principled way to distinguish between Jones's internal motivations, her intrinsic capacities, and the actions of some contextual factors that exist external to Jones, like an interfering scientist, to alter those capacities. So if something in the external environment can interfere to prevent her from doing something, then something in the external environment can interfere to give her the ability to do something. If it can take away a capacity, it can give a capacity. And that means that we haven't determined that her eating the cake instead of the peach, for example, was necessarily based on her internal motivations. It could have been that that capacity was given to her for some. I mean, you'd have to come up with a whole thought experiment around it to, make it work with peaches and cake. But there's no way to, in principle, sort of draw that line, that distinction, and say, no, this is clearly internally motivated, but this other thing is clearly externally motivated. The prevention is clearly external, but the intention that the moral responsibility supervenes on is clearly internal. That's Levy's point. So what he's saying is that it's a mistake then to attribute moral responsibility to the agent's internal motivations alone in Frankfurt-style cases. Thus, Frankfurt fails, in Levy's view, to articulate a convincing counterargument to the PAP. So even if the PAP fails, there may be other arguments that justify the attribution of moral responsibility to agents based upon their choices. Patricia Churchland, and she's the wife of Paul Churchland, who we read in the last module, who argued against property dualism and for a form of eliminative materialism, although he didn't get into that so deeply. But Paul and Pat Churchland, both very smart neuroscientists as well as philosophers, who often take a neuroscientific approach to questions of philosophy, whether it has to do with consciousness or free will or other concepts. So Pat Churchland suggests that from a neuroscientific point of view, hard determinism is probably right. And that sort of tracks with the Churchlands and their whole eliminative materialist kind of position. Very sort of hard-headed, scientific, deterministic thinkers. But Churchland acknowledges that the functioning of our society depends upon the ascription of responsibility to people for their behaviors. You can't have a functioning society if you're not able to attribute blame or praise even. Even in a deterministic universe, even in a universe where everything is fully determined, all the way back to the Big Bang, we're forced to impose some limits upon antisocial behavior, right? In order to protect our lives and to ensure social cohesion, you have to be able to say people are responsible for their actions, and you have to be able to act upon that in some sense if you're going to have a functioning society. So we're forced into this position. And Churchland proposes that what is required is an updating of our concept of freedom, but it's a different one than the compatibilist updating, because I don't think she draws the same kind of internal-external causation distinction. For her, it's not going to be your desires and motivations. It's going to be your neurobiology. It's going to be your brain. It's going to be your nervous system. It's going to be deterministic. It's going to be the laws of physics as they sort of underlie the laws of biology and neurobiology, neurochemistry, etc. So she suggests we're not free because we stand outside of the causal sequence of nature. Nothing does. Everything is part of that causal chain, including our brains, including our thoughts and actions. But we're free inasmuch as we are able to exert some degree of self-control over our actions. And for Churchland, that gets this out of the territory of philosophy and into the territory of neurobiology. And ultimately, she thinks this is a question what self-control is, how there can be degrees of self-control, how these influence our ability to do or not do different things, perform behaviors that are either useful, helpful, damaging. All of that bottoms out in neuroscience. So that's going to be her alternative suggestion here. And I don't know. What do you guys think? That's convincing? Does she? For me, I think it's a little underdeveloped. I think this just kind of restates hard determinism, maybe. But in a sense, that's probably her point, though. I don't think it gets us really around the moral responsibility question, though. But maybe it does. Maybe I'm wrong. So for many philosophers, simply redefining the word freedom isn't going to cut it. That misses the point of the problem. You're just playing linguistic games at this point. We're still dealing with the fact that we want to say that we have the free ability to make choices between alternative possibilities, and we still have that in conflict with a deterministic understanding of the universe. So along comes William James to suggest that if the word freedom is ambiguous enough to be claimed by both the hard determinist and the soft determinist, then maybe that term is just not doing any work. Maybe it's lost all meaning and we should abandon it. Maybe we should stop using words that are that ambiguous. So James suggests instead that escaping the iron grasp of determinism requires that some gap exist in the universe through which some element of genuine chance or randomness can enter into our decisions. So he's going to argue for indeterminism. He wants to argue on the side of free will. James was a big believer in free will. And this is, he's going to take that, he's going to stake out that position by challenging determinism. So James is one of the originators of a school of contemporary philosophy known as pragmatism, which the turn of the 20th century is one of the big schools that sort of after the modern period, after Kant and all of that, and Hegel, and you get into the modern period with like analytic philosophy, continental philosophy. The other school that sort of grew out of all of that was the school of pragmatism. The other guys, Charles Sanders Peirce and John Dewey, were really big in the formation of this. Dewey, also a guy I highly recommend reading. Pragmatism, and this is a really crude definition of it that does not do justice to it, but pragmatism, James's form of pragmatism anyway, suggests that when we talk about truth, what we're actually talking about is what works in the real world. That when we say something is true, what we mean is that it works. What we mean is that it's successful, that it produces, that what happens is what we were trying to make happen. That something is true if when we push the universe doesn't push back and say no. If it works, that's all we're saying. That truth is basically just a word, a complimentary word, a eulogistic word, that's really describing just, we tried an experiment and it worked. I mean, that's it. We tried to do something and we didn't fail. So when we say something's true, it's kind of a deflationary view. So he's going to take that same kind of pragmatic approach to the question of free will. So when we're faced with a question, James thinks, that appears ultimately undecidable, and he thinks this free will determinism question is undecidable. There's no evidence. We don't even know what evidence would look like that would necessarily decide this for free will libertarianism or for hard determinism, and just be able to point to and say, okay, we've solved the problem. He thinks that it's ultimately undecidable, and when you're faced with an undecidable question, then you should make a pragmatic choice. You should choose whichever alternative appears both the most satisfying and the most rational. So, what does he mean by that? So, if between free will and determinism, which perspective provides a more compelling and fulfilling vision of life? And this is a very Jamesian way to look at things. If you have this choice between two positions and you have no certainty, you don't have anything you can point to that is going to absolutely determine between the two positions, then the thing you should be asking is, okay, well, which one works best? Which one makes the better life? Which one makes the better world? Which one would make the world a better place if I believed it? And upon this basis, James is going to argue that we should prefer a form of free will that is based in indeterminism, in the rejection of determinism. So for the determinist, every evil, every bad thing that has or will happen is preordained. It's all fated. It's from the beginning of time. Like every atrocity, every war, every death, every horrible thing that has happened throughout history was all preordained, which is a very pessimistic picture of the world. This universe that's got cruelty sort of baked into it. That the Holocaust was always going to happen. That's just part of the nature of the causal structure of the universe, right? And this, to James, this deterministic world appears to be a world in which, therefore, an evil is necessary. That evil is baked in to the structure of the world. But there's a problem with this. There's a lot of problems with this. If the world is necessarily evil, then what rational ground would we have to express any regret about the occurrence of evil? If it's, evil is built in, it's necessary. It's part of the structure of things. It's an inevitable factor of the causal chain. So why regret it? Why worry about it? Why have any moral feelings about it whatsoever? Regret would seem to be a mistake. It's an error. It's a mistake to regret that there's evil in the world if evil is necessary. But if regret's an error, then it is also an error that we were predetermined to make. So there was always going to be evil, and we were always going to regret that evil. That is also necessary. Everything from the Big Bang, from the beginning of time, built these two things into the fabric of the universe. So it follows that error must be a necessary feature of the world. So we're caught, for James, on the horns of a dilemma here. We've got two choices. We've got a world of necessary evil or a world of necessary error. A world where either evil is just a part of the structure of the universe and it's a mistake to regret it and wish that the world were better. Or a world where error is just built in, where having a mistaken opinion about things, about the nature of the universe, is something that is itself built into the nature of the universe. And this appears irrational to James. So this is his argument for the rationality of indeterminism. That if you really look at determinism, that you're going to be led to irrational conclusions, according to James. And so the deterministic universe appears to be no more rational than the indeterministic. And again, I think that's really what he's trying to do. He's not necessarily trying to say that indeterminism is more rational than determinism or any other position. I think he's trying to rescue chance and indeterminism and randomness from the accusation of irrationality. He's trying to place it on an equal plane, that it's just as rational to choose. So if you're going to make the choice based on reason, then there's nothing that is going to necessarily push you in the direction of determinism or indeterminism. So the choice needs to be made on the basis of which you think works better for producing the kind of world that you'd want to live in. Which one creates a better life? So our choice then turns upon whichever option would produce the most pragmatically satisfying life. And thus James famously declares that his first free act will be to declare his belief in his own freedom. And that's the sort of thing where, as an example of like how good of a writer James is, just sort of pithy things like that, where he's able to, okay, I declare my first free act then is to declare my belief in freedom. And I think that's a good place to wrap up. This one was a little bit lighter than the last two modules, hopefully, which I think were kind of heavy lifts. So check out the written version of this if you want to see an existential comic, or if you just want to have it on hand for the quiz and the discussion portion. This is our last discussion, and we have one more quiz after that, and for Module 6, and then we're going to be heading straight into final paper portion of the course. So that's coming up. Anyway, thanks for watching, and hope you guys got something out of this, and I'll see you again soon.